you, and then we'll celebrate the resurrection together that Sunday. And as we come closer to the Lion Swimming Retreat, Angelica, who's in the back, if you have any questions about that, there is information at the Welcome Center, or you can grab a hold of Angelica with any questions that you might have. So with that, this morning we're going to continue this journey to the empty tomb. And we're going to be looking at John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. And I just want us to allow this passage to just kind of wash over us for a second. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." It's an interesting story taking place here in John chapter 12. Jesus is present. He attends a dinner that's being held. We have Martha, Mary, as they frequently do. Lazarus is there. And just take a moment to let that sink in, that you're at a dinner party with a guy who used to be dead and now is alive. And not like the story I share where I was dead for 9 seconds, but somebody who was wrapped up, entombed, sealed off for a couple of days, and everybody was assuming that he smelled because he's been dead for so long. This was legitimate. He was dead for a prolonged period of time. He's raised to life now. He's at the party. Jesus is at the party. And all of a sudden, Mary steps away from the table. And she goes and gets this jar of expensive ointment, to this expensive perfume. And she takes this jar of expensive perfume and she comes up to the table and she starts pouring it on Jesus' feet. And then once she does that, she takes her hair in her hand and uses that to dry his feet. Uncomfortable. I mean, can you imagine yesterday at the potluck if somebody started wiping down someone else's feet with perfume and they've got their hair and they're drying off someone's feet with their hair? A little weird. I'm sure that we'd be talking about that for several weeks now. Like, what was that all about? But here's Mary. And she doesn't care what anybody's thinking. This is something she wants to do, something that bubbles up from her heart that she wants to do in worship of Jesus. You can say it's extravagant worship. Extravagant worship. What does extravagant mean? The word means spending much more than is necessary or wise, to be wasteful. What Mary was doing in worship of the Lord was wasteful. And Judas points this out. It says, if you're not going to use it for yourself, we could have sold that and given that money to the poor. I mean, nobody else is doing this. Why does Mary have to put herself out there and be the only one doing this? Is she trying to draw attention to herself? Why is she wasting all of this perfume? This isn't necessary. Jesus never asked for this. It's not really wise. You're just dumping out expensive perfume for nothing. But notice the complaint that Judas raises in verse 5. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Fair point. I can see where Judas is coming from. Now, nobody else in the room knows that Judas is only thinking about Judas. Like, hey, if we sold that, that's a lot of money in the pot, and I like to kind of dip into that pot on occasion. In fact, a denarius was a typical one-day wage for a common laborer. So what Judas is saying, this 300 denarii, he's saying we could have sold this perfume for an entire year's wages. Now, guys, I don't know about you, but if your wife bought perfume that cost a year's salary, you might want to have a family meeting. Just saying. The average annual salary in America today is $52,000. So let's plug that into this equation. And Mary takes this bottle of perfume that cost $52,000 and just pours it out on Jesus' feet. I kind of see Judas's point. Not his point about wanting to steal some of that money for himself. But imagine the good that you could do for the kingdom if you had $52,000 extra just laying around. The good that could be done with that, the needs that could be met with it, but Mary just pours it out. In Judas's mind, she flushes it all down the toilet. It's extravagant worship. She did it for no other reason than to express her love to Jesus. So there's extravagant worship being showed by Mary, but there's also Judas thinking. There's also a Judas type of thinking. Judas sits back and he watches this unfold. And he says, this is ridiculous. This is a little over the top. It's a little unnecessary. It's not convenient for Judas because Judas is like, I could have easily slipped at least a few hundred off of the profits of selling that jar. Judas has problems with this that could have better been used for ministry purposes. I mean, who does Mary think that she is? Or why is she trying to draw attention to herself? And he becomes, in a sense, the worship police. Judas decides that it's his job, essentially, to sit back and monitor what is appropriate worship and what is inappropriate worship. And he calls Mary out publicly saying, what you're doing now is inappropriate worship because it's over the top. Jesus didn't ask for that. It's wasteful. It's above and beyond what's necessary. It's kind of embarrassing. We don't like that. We'd rather do something else with that. But notice how he also spiritualizes his own heart. He tries to make it sound spiritual. He's not willing to say, hey, I could have sold that money, given a bunch of it to the poor, and kept some for myself. It's like, we could have given that $52,000 to the poor. He's making a spiritual argument. And I don't know, if we're in the room, whose side do we take? Do we take Mary's side and say, well, yeah, this was beautiful and wonderful and we've got no problem with it? Or do we say, Judas kind of has a point? What was the purpose? She could have just said, Jesus, I love you, and left it at that. Why did she have to do this? That's Judas thinking. It fascinates me as I look at the story and look at how Mary responds to Jesus and how Judas responds to Mary. And I look at my own heart when it comes to the issue of worship. Mary enters that room and she doesn't think for a second about what anybody else in that room thinks about what she's doing. She doesn't think for a second about, boy, you know, what am I going to do with this jar of perfume? Do I just keep it and use it for myself? Do I sell it to kind of pay for some of the needs my family has? Do I donate it so it can be used to help the poor and help Jesus' ministry? What do I do with it? And suddenly, for some reason, while they're sitting there at this dinner party, she says, I know. I'm just going to dump it out on his feet. That's how I'm going to express my love and worship of Jesus. And I've noticed in my own heart the times where I have failed to be Mary because I was too busy being Judas. Because with the heart of Judas, it's easy to sit back and those moments where the presence of Jesus just overwhelms you. And well, if I do that, people are going to think I'm weird. If I raise my hands too high for too long, then people might start looking, and what are they going to think, and what might they say? Or, if I do more than sway, what are they going to say or think or do? And all of a sudden, I'm not responding to Jesus. I'm responding, and it's not about you guys. It's no matter where I go, a conference or whatever, in worship, there's always this thought of, but what are they going to think? What's this person going to think? Are they going to now kind of turn an eye to me because I've done it too? I remember especially at seminary when we would have chapel, there was one guy who was very expressive in his worship. And I would often sit there and just, it's so annoying. Why does he do that? He wants attention, that's all. And I would critique this guy's worship every time we had chapel, but then I actually got to meet him and know him. And he just had a heart that was really enraptured with Jesus. And all those hours I spent, instead of worshiping the Lord myself, like, there he goes again. He's doing that again. Why does he do that? I noticed I've been Judas. I've been policing because how he worshiped was inconvenient for me. It didn't fit my frame of reference. It didn't fit inside my neat, tidy little box. And so I sat as judge over him. Like, well, he should do it differently because of this, or he should do, it's not appropriate. It's excessive. It's too much. It's more than necessary. It's more than wise. It's wasteful. It's extravagant. And why did I really have a problem with what he was doing? Because I wasn't doing it. Because we're in a service of worshiping Jesus. And he was acting like Jesus was actually in the room. And he was responding accordingly. And I was not responding like Jesus was actually in the room. I was responding like I was just sitting in a seminary chapel service thinking about getting back to class and what assignment I still had to work on. And I wasn't responding to the presence of Jesus. He was. It made me feel convicted. So instead of saying, Lord, forgive me for not responding to you in worship, I'd rather kind of mentally beat him up for how he's worshiping. It's amazed me in different church settings where you get somebody who's really excited about Jesus and really expressive in worship. And sometimes the more seasoned saints will walk up to that person and be like, kind of like, oh, that's cute. You'll get over it as you mature in the Lord. Why do we do that? We do it with young couples too. Young newlyweds, always holding hands, arms around each other, always affectionate. I'm like, you'll get over it. Why should they? Why should they? Well, we associate maturity with don't show any affection for anybody or anything. That's not true. So we think the person who's excited about Jesus, they'll snap out of it eventually. Person who's just completely enraptured with their spouse, they'll get over it. They'll get bored like the rest of us. Why? Why can't we respond to Jesus like Mary? I just want to respond to Jesus. And not think through the logistics and say, well, are you saying that if somebody wants to do somersaults down the middle aisle that they should? Well, if their heart is that overcome with Jesus and they're not doing it just because they want everyone to look at them, I'm in the front row, I won't know. But what does that do to us? We have this Judas moment of, that's not appropriate. That's excessive. Rather than encouraging people, worship like Jesus is standing right here. Worship like Jesus is standing right in front of you. what would that do to our worship? The first question I want us to interact with, and maybe throughout this week, or if you just on the back of your notes page, just write this question down and really think through it. But what dictates your worship? What dictates how you worship Jesus? Is it the expectations you feel around you? Is it, well, this is just how I am? Or is it, Jesus, how do you want me to respond to you? We can be so uncomfortable with clapping, but then we go to the Psalms and people are clapping all over the place. What dictates how we worship? Is our worship dictated by Jesus is right here and I'm going to respond accordingly? And for each person, that might look different. But do we respond to Jesus? Is his presence what dictates how we worship him? But the second, maybe more challenging question is, do you police the worship of others? Do we sit back and critique? There's a comedy routine that at first it's like, oh, it's kind of funny, but then the more I thought about it, it's like, oh, it's kind of makes me self-conscious. It talks about how Christians raise their hands in worship, and there's like the touchdown and all these things, and it's like, okay, it's kind of funny, but then it makes me all paranoid when I do that, like, oh, someone's thinking that of me. And do we police the worship of others? If somebody's clapping off beat, do we have to turn and kind of laugh at them or point it out? If somebody's singing horribly or out of tune, do we kind of scowl at them? I've talked before about one lady at the first church I served at, a little country church. This one woman, she could not carry a tune if you gave her a wheelbarrow, a dump truck, and any other device that could help her carry anything. But she sang her heart out. It was beautiful. The second church I served at, there was a man with pretty severe Down syndrome. And he worshiped loudly. To human ears, it sounded horrific. But with spiritual ears, it was beautiful. Until halfway through a song, he'd yell out, "Go Browns," and that's like, oh, got to police that. I'll police that, but not the worship part. Do we allow our hearts to respond to Jesus? Again, that's not going to look the same for everybody. There's no script of this is the appropriate way for you to worship. But if you think about the presence of Jesus, what does he stir within your heart in response? There's times you might say, you know what, we're all standing, but I feel like I need to sit because I'm just overwhelmed by the presence of the Lord. Please know you have the freedom to sit. Say, well, we're sitting and singing, but I feel like I got to stand. Please stand. Are we willing to allow Jesus to be the one who dictates how we worship him? Say, what does this have to do with a journey to the empty tomb? It's a snapshot in the life of Jesus where Jesus steps up in verse 7 and defends her worship. It says, leave her alone. It's her jar of perfume. If this is how she wants to worship me, I have no problem with it. Do we respond to Jesus when we worship? I struggle with it of what's the person behind me going to think? The poor person in front of me who has to hear me, the people to my side, what are they going to think? How are they going to respond? And we self-edit and say, Jesus, I know this is a moment to worship you, but I'm more concerned about these folks here. Or do we say, Jesus, you are here and that's all I care about right now? If I had a $52,000 jar of perfume, maybe I'd dump that out on your feet too. I don't know. But do we allow the presence of Jesus to determine how we respond in worship? Let's pray. Lord